Today is Frank Mitloehner. So Dr. Frank Mitloehner, Director of the CLEAR Center at University of California, Davis. Dr. Mitloehner will be speaking about changing the narrative, animal agriculture as a path forward to climate neutrality. So before I turn things over to Dr. Mitloehner, I do have a poll question for you. So the poll question is, if we can get it up on the screen, how long does methane stay in our atmosphere before it is broken down and removed? Do you think it is 4 years, 12 years, 75 years, centuries, or you have no idea at all and cannot wait for Dr. Mitloehner to explain this? All right, and the results are in. So a little bit of a mixed bag. Most of you, though, cannot wait for Dr. Mitloehner to jump right into this. So I will go ahead, without further ado, turn it over to Dr. Mitloehner, and we will enjoy his session, I'm sure.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for having me today and have me talk about the narrative around animal agriculture's carbon footprint pretty much and the path to climate neutrality. I think this is a really important topic, as you can imagine. I've been working on this for quite some time. Before I get started, I'm on Twitter, pretty active there. GHG Guru is my handle. Please follow me. I also have put together a couple of items that you might find interesting. If indeed this presentation today perks your interest, we've done a YouTube video called Rethinking Methane, and that's a 5-minute video encapsulating pretty much everything I'm saying today. And then most recently, I've been interviewed by a YouTuber, and out came this video, Eating Less Meat Won't Save the Planet. Here's why. I strongly encourage you to check this one out. I've also put it into the chat. Well, okay, no, maybe not. Anyhow, so yeah, check it out. I would say close to 1 million people have watched this already in just a few days after its release. So what are our consumers oftentimes confronted with? Well, statistics like this. This is from Our World in Data. It's a comparison of animal source foods such as beef, lamb, and so on, and the carbon footprint these products have with other things such as tomatoes, bananas, and so on. And the comparison is based on a per kilogram of food product basis. So you really have to think about that. They're comparing a kilogram of beef, for example, or a kilogram of dairy, a kilogram of eggs, to a kilogram of tomatoes and bananas. I mean, why do I have to explain to anyone that this is not a particularly good denominator to use, considering the incredible differences in nutrient density and so on? But that's what people do. First of all, they use the denominator that makes no sense whatsoever. And secondly, they like to use global data. They like to use global data, and this is a fallacy that I've been going on and on and on about for the longest time. This is like somebody asking you, hey, what are the emissions of a car? You might think about that for a second, and then you might have some follow-up questions. A car, how old? Made and model? Driven where? In the Sahara or in the Arctic area or on the German Autobahn? Driven where? Driven by whom? An 18-year-old or an 80-year-old? And so on and so on. You can ask many, many questions, and you should, because there's a huge variability around emissions from a car throughout the world and so on. The same variability exists around animal source foods and other food items. So how in the world does it happen that people put out global averages for items such as beef, like this one here did? But anyhow, so this happens all the time. And then more importantly, or most importantly, you see that when you look at something like beef, you see that there's a large amount of brown here, and brown indicates the contribution of beef, of the beef footprint that is made up by methane. And methane is really, in my opinion, the Achilles heel of animal agriculture, at least on the environmental side. And I will spend some time explaining why. First of all, there are some people who say, as long as we change what we eat, we are changing climate impacts globally. Well, I doubt that seriously. You see on this slide here that globally all human activities amount to 49 gigatons of greenhouse gases. 49 gigatons, almost 50. of those 49 gigatons, the United States is responsible for about 12%. And as you can see here, the lion's share of the 12%, namely 11, is around the use of fossil fuel. That's cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, power plants, cement industry, and so on. And it's a little bit over 1% of global greenhouse gases that's associated with our food supply and consumption. And it is half of 1% of food production and consumption that is the number for the carbon footprint. Okay, half a percent of global greenhouse gases stem from animal agriculture and consuming the resulting products. The EPA, of course, puts out emission inventories regularly, and that includes also a delineation of the beef carbon footprint, other animal eggs carbon footprints, and so on. And here you see the carbon footprint according to the EPA caused by beef in orange, and then in blue by other livestock species. So you can see it's not nothing. There is a footprint there, but that is certainly dwarfed by what you see here in this reddish color, and that's largely the different fossil fuel consuming sectors. So the focus, and really the focus of our carbon discussions, our greenhouse gas discussions on beef is probably ill-advised in my opinion. But anyhow, so we have to deal with this. Now, how do greenhouse gases, how are greenhouse gases compared to one another? Well, since the 1990s, a unit has been used called GWP 100, global warming potential. And the global warming potential compares pretty much the effects on climate between CO2 on the one hand and then other greenhouse gases like methane, nitrous oxide. And what it says is that methane is a potent greenhouse gas, 28 times more potent than CO2, and nitrous oxide even more potent, 265 times more potent than CO2. However, this unit has come under extensive criticism because methane is compared to CO2 when indeed methane is a totally different gas. Because while CO2 and nitrous oxide are only produced, methane is both produced and destroyed. And this GWP 100 unit acts as if methane were not destroyed, as if there were no so-called atmospheric removals happening. This is a term you need to remember, atmospheric removals, okay? So, if, for example, a dairy produces 10 tons of methane, all you need to do is multiply 10 tons, times 28, and then you get what's called the CO2 equivalent amount of greenhouse gases from the 10 tons. So 10 times 28 is 280. That's 280 CO2 equivalent tons of that gas, okay? So that's how that works. GWP 100. Now, I will take you on my little methane journey. I just told you that methane is not just produced, but methane is also removed, is also destroyed, meaning there are sources in the world and there are sinks in the world for methane. On the left side, you see the sources. Sources such as fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, wetlands, and so on. All these sources amount globally to a total of approximately 560 teragrams of methane. This is where most of the reporting in the media stops, when indeed it shouldn't, because on the other side, you see that there are total sinks, meaning processes that destroy methane, amounting for approximately 550 teragrams, meaning 560 teragrams are produced and 550 teragrams are removed. So globally, we are not dealing with 560, we are dealing with the difference between the one and the other, and that's 10. Still a number that's too high and one that we seek to further reduce. But it's an important part of the narrative, obviously, that there is a significant removal of methane in the atmosphere. And when you look at this large arrow pointing down here, you see it says sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. What are those? Well, they are so-called radicals. These are molecules that steal away the hydrogen from the methane. And that happens approximately within a decade. To be precise, it's around 12 years, 10 to 12 years. So there's a very large removal, atmospheric removal of methane that's caused by these radicals destroying methane. And that happens again within a decade. And that has, as a result, that methane has, in contrast to the other greenhouse gases, a very short lifespan. So CO2 has a lifespan of 1,000 years. Imagine that. If you drive your car, you burn gasoline, and when you do, you produce CO2. And that CO2 stays in the air for 1,000 years. That means anytime you've ever driven your car, you produce CO2, and all of that is still out there. Same is true for any kind of fossil fuel consuming activity that you engage in. So take home message here, methane is a so-called short-lived climate pollutant, and the other ones are long-lived climate pollutants. Okay. Now the question, where does methane, CH4 is methane, where does this methane get its carbon from? And what happens to methane after these 10, 12 years in the atmosphere? And that discussion starts with plants and with the question, what do plants to live? They need obviously sunlight, they need water, and they need a form of CO2. And during photosynthesis, that atmospheric CO2, carbon dioxide, makes its way into those plants. The plants then convert the CO2 carbon into carbohydrates. In the case of grasses, that carbohydrate would be cellulose. In the case of other feedstuff, it would be maybe starch. So that atmospheric carbon goes into plants, it becomes carbohydrates. Livestock, let's say a cow in this case, comes along and eats the above ground material, and then during a process called enteric fermentation, produces some of that carbon into methane, CH4. The question is this carbon in the methane, is that new carbon that we've added into the atmosphere through this livestock? And the answer is no, it's not new. It's recycled, because this carbon in the methane molecule is identical to the carbon in the CO2. So it's a recycled form of carbon and not a new, that's important, not a new and additional source of carbon. If we were to have constant livestock herds, and that has been the case for a long time, actually with slightly decreasing livestock herds, then we are not adding new additional carbon to the atmosphere. We're not adding new additional methane to the atmosphere, because methane is both produced and destroyed. And hence we are not adding new additional warming to our planet. Constant livestock herds do not add additional warming to our planet. And that matters because the Paris Climate Accord and all the other agreements are clear about our desire to keep the warming at bay, not the carbon emissions at bay, the warming at bay and below 2 degrees increase. Okay, that's what the whole thing is all about. So what happens to the methane? The methane then, after about a decade, is broken down, process called oxidation, to be precise, hydroxyl oxidation, and that methane is then destroyed and made into CO2 again. Now you might ask, is that a good or bad thing? You just told us methane has a lifespan of 10 years. CO2 has one of 1,000 years. That's not the question, okay? The question is not, is that a good or bad thing? The question is, do our livestock herds add new additional carbon to the atmosphere? And the answer to that is no, they don't. Because when that methane breaks down back into CO2, that is the same kind of CO2 as it was when it went into the plants. This is called the biogenic carbon cycle. Some call it the biological carbon cycle, where carbon goes around and around and around from the atmosphere into the plant, into the animal, to the atmosphere, the plant, the animal, and so on. That goes around and around. So it's a cyclical situation here on the livestock side. Is this similar or different from fossil fuel, let's say, derived greenhouse gases? Fossil fuels, just so you're clear, are by far the main source of greenhouse gases from human activity. Here in the United States, fossil fuel use is to be blamed for at least 80%, 80, of all greenhouse gases. And that's according to the Environmental Protection Agency. So how do greenhouse gases from fossil fuel use differ from this livestock cycle here? Well, they differ significantly. So what are fossil fuels? These are oil, coal, and gas that used to be forests and animals, such as dinosaurs. These plants and animals died, decayed, fossilized, and accumulated in the ground for a long, long time, until around 70 years ago, humans started to extract those fossil fuels We extracted them from the ground where they were for so long, and we burned them. And when we burned them, we burned that carbon and put it into the atmosphere. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is not a short cycle like the livestock biogenic carbon cycle, but it is a one-way street from the ground up into the air. So this is a very important comparison between livestock and fossil fuel-derived greenhouse gases. Now, colleagues from the University of Oxford brought to the attention of the world, really, that this GWP 100 is really not a unit fit for purpose to quantify the warming impact, for example, of livestock. Why not? Because GWP 100 does not take into consideration the atmospheric removal, the fact that methane is not just produced, but also destroyed. GWP 100 doesn't do that, okay? And GWP 100 does not really predict warming. It only converts methane into CO2e. That's it. That's all it does. So they said this is not a unit fit for purpose. We understand it has been used for so long, but it's wrong and it needs to be changed. So they developed a new unit called GWP Star. This GWP Star actually looks at how methane affects warming. Okay, and that's what it's all about. You know, I know you hear about carbon footprint of this and that all the time, but what we really should focus on is the actual warming footprint and not just the carbon footprint. So GWP Star actually looks at the warming impact of methane. The authors of GWP Star worked out that GWP 100, this old unit from 1990, overestimates the impact of methane sources from a constant source, for example, constant cattle herd, by a factor of 4. We're currently exaggerating the impact of our constant herds by at least a factor of 4. And this GWP 100, this old unit, cannot predict accurately the impact of methane when methane goes down. So what happened when methane goes down? This is a very interesting question that I will address in a minute. And so not only does GWP Star take care of characterizing the short lifespan of methane, but it characterizes the fact that it's naturally removed from the atmosphere, okay? And I will show you now why that matters. I will compare first two gases that are really important. One is CO2 and the other is methane. And then I will use an analogy to really drive it home, because it's very important that you understand the next few slides. So let's imagine you were to drive from home to work on Monday, day 1. If you were to do that, you were to burn gas, and that would put CO2 into the atmosphere. On Tuesday, you drive again, you put new additional CO2 into the atmosphere, which is now in addition to the stock that you put out the first day, Monday. On Wednesday, you drive again, same thing, you put new additional CO2 into the atmosphere, which is now added to the existing stock from the day prior, and, well, you know, you get the gist of it. Every time you burn fossil fuel, you add new additional carbon to the atmosphere, okay? Because of that, this gas, CO2, is called a stock gas, because every time you burn fossil fuel, you add new additional CO2 to the existing stock. It's a cumulative gas. Please remember that. Is methane the same? Also a stock gas, because currently it is treated as if it were a stock gas. GWP 100, which is the unit everybody had been using for the last 30 years, treats methane as if it were a stock gas, as if it were to accumulate just like methane does. And the answer to that is no, methane is not a stock gas, methane is a flow gas. And that means methane is produced and destroyed at almost equal rates. So for example, if you were to have a dairy and you started that dairy 50 years ago, then only during the first 10 years, you added new additional methane from those cows to the atmosphere. After the first 10 years, the amount of methane produced and the amount of methane destroyed were in balance, okay? And that's because of that atmospheric removal that I was talking about earlier. And now I use an analogy because I love analogies. And I use an analogy for CO2 and one for methane. So imagine a bathtub, okay? A bathtub, the first bathtub, being a bathtub that does have no drain. All it has is a faucet, but no drain. Every time you turn that faucet on, water runs into the bathtub, and as a result, the levels go up. They can only go up because there's no drain. Okay, that's the analogy for CO2. It's a bathtub with no drain. Every time you burn fossil fuel, you produce more CO2, and that increases warming. Now comes the second bathtub analogy, the one for methane. Here you have a faucet on the one side, but you have a drain on the other side. And the drain, of course, is the atmospheric removal of methane. So let's say you turn your faucet on normal. You put water into the bathtub, but your drain is open, meaning at the rate you put water in, water comes out of the drain, okay? And as a result, the water level does not change. It stays stable. And that's what happens under current livestock situations here in the United States and in most developed countries. Herds are not increasing, they are pretty stable. The amount of methane produced by animals is almost equal to the amount of methane removed through oxidation. In part of the developing world, though, the increasing demand for animal source foods leads to an increasing herd size. People grow their herds, and then you add new additional methane to the existing methane that was produced a decade ago. So there, you would crank that faucet up all the way, and now you put more water in that you let go of through the drain. And that means now methane levels can rise, water levels can rise, and of course, you get the gist of it. But what happens when you turn the faucet on low? You turn it off, but not quite off. You still have it on, and your drain is all the way open. Well, in that case, your methane levels go down. Your methane or your water levels go down. So if you reduce methane, in other words, if you reduce methane, then the warming caused by that methane is decreasing. That's called negative warming, okay? And negative warming is just a fancy word for cooling. All right, so the people who brought this to our attention here, this whole difference between stock and flow gases, the people who brought this to our attention are from the University of Oxford, around Miles Allen. Professor Allen is an atmospheric physicist who said, look, what we're currently doing with methane is just wrong because we are not taking into consideration this very important process of atmospheric removal. Hence, he came up with this other unit I just talked about, the GWP Star. And now I will show you how GWP 100, this old unit, compares to this new unit, GWP Star. And I will use 3 different methane scenarios to show you the difference. The first one is one where methane over 30 years increases by 35%. So this would happen, let's say, in developing countries where herd sizes grow and as a result, methane grows from these animals. The second scenario is one where methane is pretty stable, maybe a slight reduction. And this is what happens in most developed countries, such as ours here. And then the third scenario is one where we decrease methane sharply. Over 30 years, we reduce it by 35%. Okay? So let's see how this increasing, the stable, and the decreasing methane scenario would be depicted using this GWP 100 unit that the world has been using until now. Well, GWP 100 would predict that in all 3 scenarios, the CO2 equivalent amounts from that methane would be a strong positive addition to our climate. Okay, so that would be that would really mean that no matter what we do with methane, whether we increase it, hold it stable, or decrease it, the greenhouse gas effects always go up strongly. Let's contrast that with GWP Star. So GWP Star agrees with GWP 100 that if you increase methane, you add a lot of additional warming, depicted here in blue. Okay, we do not want to increase methane, or else we increase warming drastically. We don't want to see that. What happens when you don't increase methane, but you hold it stable, or maybe slightly reduce it? Then you don't have any blue north of the x-axis, and that means no additional warming. But because there's a slight reduction happening here, you see a little bit, you see a negative sign in front of the number. And that means now you have a little bit of negative warming, in sharp contrast to what you see predicted under GWP 100. But what happens when you decrease methane strongly by 35%? Well, then you pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, and that leads to negative warming, to strong cooling. And this would be the equivalent of, let's say, planting a forest with the trees sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis. That is another way of negative warming. But when we do the same with methane, when we reduce methane, then that leads to an immediate impact on our climate. I will show you another pretty technical slide, but it's important to really get this across. A slide that compares CO2 and methane to one another. So let's just say there were a power plant, and over 30 years, that power plant were to produce more and more and more power over time. Okay, and as a result, it would produce more and more and more CO2 over time. How would this increase in CO2 emissions work out on warming? Well, it would lead to an exponential increase in warming. Why exponential and not linear? Because it's a cumulative gas. Okay, that's why. If you, let's say, have a feedlot with 10,000 cattle and you grow it to 15,000 cattle, then that would also lead to increasing amounts of methane over time. And the impact that would have on warming would be a linear increase. A linear increase of methane from a source leads to linear increase in the warming from that source. So this is the scenario here, that methane scenario that we are seeing in the developing world right now. Okay. Now comes the scenario for both CO2 and methane that's constant emissions. Let's say our power plant were to be at constant load, producing constant amounts of CO2. How would this constant amount of CO2 affect climate? Well, it would still lead, even though it's constant emissions of CO2, still lead to increasing warming. Why? Because it's cumulative. You remember that little pyramid I showed you? It's a stock gas, and every time you burn fossil fuel, let's say, then you add to what you put out yesterday and the day before and so on. So constant emissions of CO2 from any source lead to increasing amounts of warming. But a constant methane source, constant emissions of methane lead to constant warming from that methane. A constant source of methane, so to break it down, constant emissions of methane lead to constant concentrations of methane in the atmosphere, and that leads to constant warming. And this is what the Paris Climate Accord and so on is. That's what they're all about, okay? To keep the warming from going up, keeping it constant or even decreasing it. That's the goal, okay? And for livestock, we can achieve that by just staying constant, by not increasing herd sizes, okay? That alone would keep the warming impacts at bay. So what happens when you decrease both CO2 and methane? What happens to the climate? Let's say our power plant were old, and over 30 years, we now finally shut it down. We ramp it down and eventually shut it down. What would happen to the warming from that reduced CO2 over time? The warming still would go up, even though the CO2 is being reduced over time. The warming would still go up all the way up to the point where we stop the power plant altogether. At that point, the warming would plateau and no longer rise. That's why the world talks about net zero, okay? Why we have to do net carbon emissions from things like fossil fuel sources. Because unless we do that, the temperature would continue to rise. That's why everybody wants to get to a total stop of using the fossil fuels. But look at what happens when you reduce methane. If and when you reduce methane, you have an instantaneous impact on climate. And that is a negative impact, negative warming. And it sounds negative, but it's good, okay? Because negative warming is cooling. So the question now will be, I'm sure you have that question, is it possible that we can achieve a scenario such as this one here, where we strongly reduce methane and as a result have a negative warming impact, meaning a cooling impact from that methane reduction? Here in California, we are always at the forefront of these kind of things. We have a new law that's called SB 1383, and that new law mandates a 40% reduction of methane to be achieved in the next 10 years, by the year 2030. So a 40% reduction. Our farmers at first went wild until they learned that the state does not aim to achieve it through the cane approach with rules and regulations and fines, but with the carrot approach of incentivizing methane reductions. And so incentivizing by financial means, of course, through capital investment help, as well as a carbon credit system that assists farmers in paying for these technologies. What you see on this slide here is a dairy here, a typical dairy in California. Normally what you see here circled by my cursor would be an open lagoon storing animal manure, off-gassing emissions to the air. But now this dairyman has put in a covered lagoon, meaning a cover over the lagoon that now traps the gases underneath. This gas mixture is called biogas, and you see it here bulging out. This biogas is 60% methane. That methane now no longer gets into the air, and this biogas is now cleaned up and made into a fuel type for vehicles. This fuel type is called RNG, renewable natural gas. If you take this biogas here from the animal manure and convert it into fuel, then you can take that fuel and put it into vehicle fleets like semi-trucks. This conversion from dairy biogas into fuel for vehicles is considered the most carbon negative fuel type there is. And again, carbon negative is a good thing because it means you're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. As a result, farmers doing this receive very large credits called the low carbon fuel standard credits, $200 per ton of CO2e. And as a result of that, we have experienced a new gold rush in California, namely one of reducing methane. As a result of that, we are already reducing 2.2 million metric tons of CO2e annually from our methane reduction. And that means, I told you we have a 40% reduction goal to be achieved by 2030. We are already 25% there, meaning over halfway. Over halfway, we have achieved a 25% reduction of methane through use of incentives that have helped us to develop technologies to get this gas out of the air. And as a result, that methane reduction itself has a cooling effect. And that cooling effect from the methane reduction counteracts nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gas emissions from these dairies. And that leads us to a path to climate neutrality, meaning the methane reduction and the related cooling can counteract some of the warming from other gases, leading us to a point where we can now predict that within the next 10 years, our dairy sector will be climate neutral. Climate neutral, meaning not impact our climate in any negative way. Now that to me is super exciting. And it's not just animal manure that can be used as one potential avenue. It's also, for example, feed additives. My colleagues and I here at UC Davis have done a lot of research on use of feed additives to reduce enteric methane, the methane that's belched out by ruminants. And we have found that some of these additives reduce methane by anywhere between 10 to 50%. So that will be in addition to what you see here presented on the animal manure front. I believe animal agriculture in the United States can be and will be on a path to climate neutrality. I think it's really high time now to explain to people why methane is different, why it's important to understand that it's different, why it's important for us to understand that there are atmospheric removals occurring, and that's important for the accounting, but also that further reductions of methane have a very positive impact on our climate. We can make our farming sector be part of a solution. Really quickly here, a couple of trends that Jude Copper and others have described earlier. We used to have 140 million beef cattle in the United States. Today we have 90 million, so much fewer, 50 million fewer, but we produce the same amount of beef as we used to with a much larger herd. So that means slaughter rate has gone down over the years, but production has gone up. Today, we produce 18% of the world's beef, with 6% of the world's beef herd in the United States. That is unprecedented. It's unbelievable, and it should make us proud, because that's what sustainability is all about, making more with less. On the dairy side, we used to have 25 million dairy cows. Today, we have 9 million, so much fewer, from 25 to 9. But with this much smaller herd today, we are producing 60% more milk. That means the carbon footprint of our herd has shrunk by 2/3. We have a lot to be proud of. On the pork side, we have tripled pork production since 1965. So what I'm telling you is we have a lot to be proud of on the production side. On the consumption side, I oftentimes get the question, shouldn't we just change what we eat to help the climate? And so I asked the question, can we eat our way out of climate change? And there are now several publications that have addressed that question. The first one here by Wines and Nicholas looked into what it would take if an omnivore were to turn vegan to protect the climate, what that reduction would be with respect to this person's carbon footprint. The reduction would be 0.8 tons of greenhouse gases, 0.8 tons. Is that a lot or not? Well, let's contrast that to one single transatlantic flight per passenger. That would be 1.6 tons of greenhouse gases, meaning you have to go vegan for 2 years to make up for the emissions that are put out when you fly to Europe once per passenger. Another authorship duo, Hall and White, looked into what would happen to our carbon footprint as a nation if we were to go meatless Monday as a nation with 330 million Americans. Well, that would lead to a 0.3% reduction of our carbon footprint in this country. And they also looked at the extreme. What were to happen theoretically if all 330 million Americans were to go vegan altogether? That would lead to a reduction of our carbon footprint by 2.6%. Now, is that nothing? No, it's not nothing, it's something. But first of all, not very desirable. I think that most people here would agree. But secondly, absolutely dwarfed by other major activities, such as the use of fossil fuel. This whole notion that what we eat has a drastic impact on our carbon footprint and on our climate is a smokescreen, okay? By the way, the smokescreen was put out years ago by the fossil fuel industry. They are the ones who brought this about, carbon footprint calculators and so on. They started that in order to sidetrack us from their own emissions. I just want to make sure everybody understands here. I'm not anti-vegan or so. I strongly believe that everybody should eat what they want to eat, or pray for who they want to pray, or love who they want to love, or vote for who they want to vote for. These are personal decisions, okay? It's none of my business what other people eat. The problem I have is when some of those folks tell me what to eat and try to prevent my kids from eating what I as a father think they should eat. So that's when I have a problem with it. So, but just to stay with this topic of veganism for a minute, I had discussions with some of the vegan leaders in this country and asked them, so what are your challenges? And they told me the biggest challenge we have is the one with the retention rate. I did not know what that meant until they explained it. And the retention rate means that issue means that 84% of vegetarians and vegans stay with their diet for only 1 year, and then they revert back to omnivores. To being omnivores, 84%. So I asked myself, well, how can that be? I mean, many of them are so dedicated and so on, but they stop after a year. Well, I don't know if it's nutrition, if it's taste, I don't know what it is, but it doesn't strike me as a particularly sustainable diet if people don't stick to it. So what this really means is that for every one active vegetarian and vegan in the United States, we have 5 former vegetarians and vegans. So to me, that's really insightful. So to me, consumption patterns are not those that will help to reduce the carbon footprint, let's say, of our animal supply chains or our food supply altogether. But there's another topic that has a major impact, and that is depicted on the last slide here. This is an average US family in front of all the food waste associated with them. In the United States, 40% of all food produced is never eaten by people. It's going to landfills. But 40% of all food is never eaten throughout the entire developed world. And these food waste issues are largely associated at the consumer level, so restaurants and our private homes. But even in the developing world, in the third world countries, 40% of food never makes it through human digestive tract. There it's called food loss, and it occurs more at the producer level because people can't harvest on time, transport the goods to the markets, process, and so on. So to me, that is something that I think we should all agree upon is absolutely unacceptable. Regardless of what you eat and what you prefer, I think we should all really make strides in reducing that horrific number because we can do better. So with that, I'm closing with just showing a webpage here for our blog. That might be of interest to many of you. And the webpage of the CLEAR Center that I'm the director of is depicted on this one here. And so with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that we get some good discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Mitloehner. We do have way more questions than we'll have time to get to in our last few minutes, but we'll get to as many as we can. One that came in both from another attendee and through the Q&A box, kind of putting them together, is why aren't more organizations using the GWP method? And if it's more accurate, then how can we get them to adopt it? So why is it not more mainstream, and how can we change that?
So this whole change in narrative is really pretty new. And one of the people who started it, Miles Allen from Oxford, is a senior contributor of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. He's one of the main actors there. Several of his colleagues on the IPCC and he are discussing that at that level. I have given a presentation to the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, on this topic, and the FAO then installed a global task force that is currently working on this very topic that I just presented, and the final report will come out in a few months, and I think it will affect public policy throughout. It's very important for people in agriculture to understand methane is not just produced, there's an atmospheric removal. Methane is almost produced and destroyed at equal rates. That makes all the difference in the world when you consider the carbon footprint, the warming footprint of our livestock. This is an important narrative, and you should all know about that.
And to go along with that, why do you believe the science about the methane cycle gets misconstrued and therefore miscommunicated to the public?
Because some people, some activists out there felt that this was a really great Achilles heel, and they gloomed onto this. And the majority of the public was unaware of it. They just felt that methane accumulates in the atmosphere just like CO2 or nitrous oxide does, and it does not. So, and I know that after I have done a lot of discussions around that, or I've had a lot of discussions around that, that the people who were glooming onto this topic are now changing it, are stopping to talk about climate, and they are moving into biodiversity and land use changes. So that shows to me that our change in the narrative has been contagious, even with those who don't like us very much.
And on that maybe hopeful note, so there's been a lot of recent news with the beef ban from President Biden that ended up being fake news or a rumor. Epicurious saying they're not going to publish any more beef recipes. And I could go on with examples of negative headlines regarding animal ag and the environment. You shared a lot of science, a lot of data, but we know that scientific fact cannot get a lot of traction, be difficult to communicate. So perhaps this is the million-dollar question. Is there hope that beef and animal ag in general will stop being the focal point of news about the climate? And if there is hope, what can we do to push back on that narrative that's out there?
Well, in my opinion, it is largely the same people who criticize the animal agriculture industries today who have done it over the last few decades. But originally they came from a different angle of animal welfare, animal rights, and they talked about food safety and pink slime and all of that stuff. And now it's climate, and from there they're moving on to biodiversity and so on. They will never stop, okay? And no matter what you will, how you will try to counter their arguments, they will never listen to you. So in my opinion, you need to stop trying that. Stop trying it. You will never convince them of your arguments. What you should do, what we should do is we should confirm to a public that largely is in favor of these products, that these products are produced in a responsible way, that they are produced using practices that are state of the art, that are world class. The world envies us for that. They envies us for the nutrient content of our foods, the way we produce them, the standards around welfare and so on that we hold high and dear. And these are the people we need to talk to. And we don't need to talk to them just in some kind of PR style, but in an authentic style that, farmers can do best. Farmers and ranchers need to stand up, and they need to say, here's what I do, here's how I raise my animals. And you know what, I'm pretty darn proud of what I do, okay? These animals mean the world to me. My land means the world to me. Those, the air, the water around it, the soil, they are my livelihood, okay? They are my livelihood. This whole complex is my legacy, and I am proud of it. That's what they should do, and not fight with a bunch of activists.
Very true. We are up on time, but we have so many in the Q&A box. I'm going to ask you one more in our last few minutes here. What about regenerative agriculture? Seems to be the latest buzzword and hot topic. Do you think that that will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, regenerative agriculture is an interesting concept, and it is important because it focuses around how we particularly can get our soils to be as healthy as they can be, because our soils can trap a lot of carbon and keep it there. So the question is, how do we do that in the best way we know of? And so while regenerative agriculture is still relatively small, I think they are sending out some signals to the rest also of conventional agriculture to adopt some of these practices. And I think that this is really good. I like the narrative around it, and I think that we can learn a lot from some of those folks who are trailblazers in this field.
Excellent. Well, we have so many more questions. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to, so I put Dr. Mitloehner's Twitter handle back up on the screen. He is a very prolific tweeter, so please, please, please do reach out to him if you have questions that did not get answered today. I know he would love to answer them. And you can